Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lectures. Dear friends, as you know that from our previous session we have been talking about cinema and censorship. We talked about the various aspects of cinema, we talked about the development of cinema, as well as we talked about the emergence or the need of censorship in cinema. Dear friends, today also we are going to carry the lecture forward and we would be discussing more on the cinema and censorship. We talked about the cinema and censorship till 1929 to 1930. We would be discussing more how or what was the condition of the cinema after 1930s, and what are the or what were the restrictions imposed on the cinema, what were the regulations which were imposed on the Indian cinema after 1930s. And for this we have again with us in our studios Dr. Manoj Sharma. Dr. Sharma is Assistant Professor in Department of History, Kirodimal College, University of Delhi. So dear friends, let's try to understand more about the cinema and censorship through Dr. Manoj Sharma. So first of all, I would like to welcome our guest Dr. Sharma. Dr. Sharma, welcome to the ADSET lecture, and as this lecture is very or I could say this very topic is very interesting. So what else you have for our students today?
Yesterday actually we discussed, very good morning to all of you firstly. Yesterday we discussed the origins of censorship basically, which initially started with the press, because you did not have cinema in those times, and in 1895 with the arrival of cinematograph, as we discussed yesterday, and thereafter especially in India in 1896 when the first moving images they were being shown at the Watson Hotel in Bombay, and then you have till 1918 no uniform censorship policy, because you did not have any kind of act to discuss films basically and to censor the films. In 1918 you have the Indian Cinematograph Act, which was initiated or promulgated by the colonial government. Before that, the decisions with regard to censors, they were generally being taken by the commissioners of police. Even after 1918 when this act came, the commissioners of police, they were the de facto board of the, they were chief of the censor boards in different provinces, that we discussed yesterday. And at the same time, the appointment of the Indian Cinematograph Committee in 1927-28 as Rangacharya as the chairman of the committee, the British government was not interested in the recommendations of this committee, because the question of imperial preferences, which was very dear to the colonial government basically, was not in a way addressed by this committee. This is what we discussed yesterday. Now we will begin from 1929-30 onwards, especially with regard to the starting of the civil disobedience movement by Mahatma Gandhi in 1930, that famous Dandi March in which Gandhi broke the salt law. So in that context, when we see some of the films which were being made, we will see that sound also came to the Indian cinema in 1931 with the arrival of Alamara. Alamara was the first film in which we find dialogues, and those dialogues came at one of the most important times when more and more people they got associated themselves with the national movement in the form of the civil disobedience movement, in which huge chunks of people they participated, including large number of women, because many of the questions they were directly related to women, and Gandhi considered that the participation of the women in the civil disobedience movement was extension of their household role. The way they participated in the movement could be connected to every household in the country, and the issues which were related to the national movement, they reached every home. So this way what we see is that some of the films which were made during this particular period, they were trying to reflect the various concerns which were related to the national movement. So Alamara, which came in 1931, it was a very opportune time for the cinema in that context, that the national movement was also in one of the important stages so that the colonial government could be thrown out of the country. And when these kind of talkies they were being made, they were in the local language, and being in the local language, this kind of advantage they had when they competed with foreign films. Foreign films being in different languages, and the ones which were being imported from America or imported from Britain, they were in English. So this kind of handicap in terms that people they were not able to understand the language, and this kind of advantage was there to the Indian films or the Hindi films which were made in 1931 and thereafter. So what we see is that many Indian film companies, they got firmly established during this particular period, and they got firmly established because the language was known to the masses. And initially many of the films which were made, they were in different genres. They were either in the mythologicals, they were also made in the genre of devotionals, historicals and biographicals. At the same time, many of the cheap commercial films, they were also being made, which were referred to as in 1940s as the masala films, when a lot of black money came into the Indian film industry because of the Second World War. Many people, they got rich during this particular period, and they did not know where to invest this kind of money, and they invested this money in cinema, because of which the important aspects which were related to Indian cinema in the form of there was a lot of the way the industry functioned was in the form of film studios. And in 1940s, what we see, star system became more important rather than the studio system. A studio system in which film stars and other technicians, they were on the payrolls of these film studios. They were going every day as we go for the jobs, and during the working hours, and they were being paid a monthly salary for the work. And what we see in 1940s, that a star system emerges, and in many of the financiers and producers of the film, now they hired film stars and other technicians, music directors, etc., and then they started making films on a freelance basis. So this was a new development, and a lot of money was being offered to film stars and other technicians so that they work in these freelancing ventures, and which saw the decline of the studio system as well. This is what we see in 1930s and 40s. What we also see is the role of a number of technicians and filmmakers in the production of various films which were associated with the national movement. Many of the filmmakers and technicians, one of them was J.B.H. Wadia. He was making a number of films which were known as the stunt films, and these stunt films which were being made by him, he was also a member, J.B.H. Wadia and Homi Wadia, they were associated with the production of stunt films, and many of the films which they made, they dealt with issues which were directly related to the national movement. And one of them was also a member of Congress party. Later he became member of the party which was launched by M.N. Roy in India. So how we see that how these people, they had certain particular kind of ideology, and how this kind of ideology got reflected in their brand of cinema, which was the stunt films. And when these stunt films, they were being shown to the masses, in which what we see is that the protagonist and the antagonist, they are being shown. The protagonist is generally shown as a semi-clad person who is talking about democracy, who is talking about good governance, which is talking about revolutionary ideas, and the antagonist who has usurped the rights which were earlier given to the protagonist. So in this way, these kind of portrayals, they aroused the masses in some way, and this is what we see, that how these technicians and the producers and the filmmakers, those who were associated with various aspects of film production, they were also associated with the various movements which were initiated for independence of India. And that is how many of the films, what we see, they had some problems with the censor authorities. Another important aspect was the sharp government reaction. The sharp government reaction was within the context of the various films, because the chairman of the censor boards were generally the commissioners of police, and these commissioners of police, they exercised their authority over cinema more frequently. And what we see is that the censorship grew more and more arbitrary, and many a times the district magistrates, they resorted to peremptory banning of films. In a way, some sort of a pre-censorship of films took place. In South India and Salem, the magistrates suspended the screening of Wrath, a film which was made in 1931 by the Imperial Film Company. And what we see is that it had political overtones. The government supported this kind of decision, and the board also agreed with the government. So what was happening was that in many of the films which were being made during this particular period, if they had some kind of objectionable scenes, objectionable dialogues which were not keeping in line with the kind of policy which was being followed by the government, then government did not support such kind of films. They did not even offer any kind of help or support to the Indian film industry at all. And what we see is that when no offer of help came from the government, and any kind of efforts which were being made by the Indian film industry, then they were given some kind of backbeating or some kind of discouragement by the colonial government. So in this sense, what we see is that many of the films which came in 1930s and thereafter, they were being banned or they were being censored by the colonial authorities. Talking about this film called Wrath, which was made in 1931, we can say that the film was talking about religious bigotry, caste system, non-violence and untouchability. All these important aspects like religious bigotry was quite rampant during this particular period in India. Then the question of caste system, which was also associated with the socio-religious reform movements which took place in 19th century and earlier part of the 20th century. And a number of films which were dealing with caste, they were also made. 1936, we have a film called Achut Kanya which was made. There was a film called Achut which was made in 1940. They were all talking about the issue of caste during this particular period. The issue of non-violence and untouchability was also very important during this particular period. Gandhi was leading this movement which was known as Gandhi was leading a movement which was based on ahimsa or the non-violence. So the Gandhian tenets which were associated with non-violence, they were quite reflected in not only in this film but other films as well. And the issue of untouchability, it was quite important during the national movement, and this was quite important in the sense that because many of the untouchables, they were not being allowed to enter temples, they had no rights in that context. So many of the films, they reflected these concerns in form of untouchability, and untouchability was one of the issues which was close to Gandhi's heart. And he said that the emancipation of women, untouchability and the issue of Hindu-Muslim unity, these were the three central issues which were close to Gandhi's heart, and he was leading a number of measures, or the way he was functioning, the Gandhi was functioning and the Congress was functioning was with regard to the removal of all these important issues which were very close to the national movement. In this film Wrath, what we see is that there is a character called Baba Garib Das, who is Kuvaji Makanda, who played this character. He had a remarkable resemblance to Mahatma Gandhi, and the way these kind of issues they were being talked in the film, they had striking resemblances to Mahatma Gandhi and the various ideological orientations which Gandhi reflected, which was not acceptable to the colonial censor authorities, because they felt that in this way they will Indians, they will be able to use cinema as some sort of a propaganda, and they did not want all these films to be used as some sort of a propaganda tactics, and that is why they rejected these kind of films. And this kind of portrayals, it in a way was not acceptable to the censor authorities, and this film was censored in a way, and it was released as Khuda Ki Shan, and it was not allowed to be exhibited by the censor authorities in the initial version in which it was filmed. So what we see is that the working of boards, of the censor boards, was generally arbitrary and irregular in nature. The kind of censorship policy which was followed by them was politically inspired, and many a times it was cynical in nature. Mrs. F. Stanley, as you can see on the screen, she was one of the members of the Bengal Censor Board, and she created a flutter when she told the press that board was not viewing many of the films which were there, and censoring was done by the inspectors. The inspectors, they were censoring a number of films. In 1935, the president of the Motion Pictures Society of India, B.V. Jadhav, as you can see on the screen. He says that, to quote him, the central government will not take the trouble of laying down any standard for the guidance of the provincial boards. Consequently, the inspectors have become autocrats and apply their scissors at their sweet will in cutting out portions which they consider as undesirable. An appeal to the board of censors is rarely of any use. So what we see is that there were no central guidelines in that sense, that what is to be included and what is to be rejected. So these kind of portrayals in the context of cinema, we see that censor boards, they did not have any kind of central guidelines in this context, and this was also recommended by the Indian Cinematograph Committee earlier. But the submission of the report of the Indian Cinematograph Committee was not adhered to. It was not given much importance by the colonial government, because the question of imperial preferences which was to be given to the British films was not addressed by the Indian Cinematograph Committee. So these kind of problems which we see in Indian cinema with regard to the censorship policy which was followed by the colonial masters. But one thing was very clear, that any of the nationalist aspirations, portrayal of the nationalist aspirations was very strictly dealt by the censor authorities. In terms of censoring of films, we see that a number of films, they attempted to portray the political fervor through various scenes and the dialogues which were being portrayed in the films. There was a film called Sone Ki Chidiya, or The Golden Bird. This film was made in 1934, and in this film a number of dialogues, they were being omitted. There is one particular dialogue which I would like to talk about, which I would like to quote. Yes, it is a rare opportunity that we get to serve our nation or country, and then we must sacrifice our business and prosperity. So this dialogue is making a particular reference to the nation or country, and they are saying that we should sacrifice everything to save our country. And another dialogue says that, may sacrifice for our country become our aim in life. Instead of living without feeling, it is better to die like this. So these kind of references in the films, in which people are making the protagonist or the people, those who are acting in the films, they are saying that we should sacrifice our lives for our country, they were not acceptable to the censor authorities. And though many of the films we do not find any direct reference to the national movement, but even in those films where we do not have any reference directly to the national movement, we will find certain dialogues in terms of undercurrents of the national movement. In many of the portrayals which were there in these films, what we will find is that they have certain undercurrents of the national movement. Various aspects of, or the ideals of the national movement, they got reflected in this kind of cinema. There was a film called Mahatma which was made, and it was banned by the censor authorities. It was suggested that it was dealing with the controversial politics. Mahatma was made during this particular period when the popularity of Mahatma Gandhi was at the peak, and the authorities, they had this kind of inkling that the title had a remarkable reference to Mahatma Gandhi, and this film was ultimately allowed to be exhibited with deletion of a number of scenes and dialogues, and the new title was given as Dharmatma. So we can very well find that Mahatma Gandhi, who was leading the national movement in this particular period, a number of films, they had a striking resemblance to the kind of characters had striking resemblances to Mahatma Gandhi, or the kind of scenes and dialogues. In many of the scenes in the dialogues, you will find that in the background portraits of Mahatma Gandhi, Nehru and other national leaders, they were being shown, as we can see in the films of later times as well, that in many of the scenes which were reflecting maybe hospital or police stations, we will find that the portraits of former prime ministers, portraits of former leaders like Nehru, Gandhi, Patel, etc., they are being shown. So when these kind of portraits, they were being shown in the film, people could get this kind of idea, people became aware about the national movement in some way. So, these kind of activities which were political in nature were not acceptable to the censor authorities, and they cut or they banned or they censored all these kind of dialogues and scenes which had any kind of reference to the national movement. And in many of the films, apart from this, what we see is there was a film called Iman Farosh, which was made in 1937. So, in this film, Inqilab Zindabad, long live the revolution, these kind of references they were being used. So, it was suggested by the censor authorities that wherever these kind of references like Inqilab Zindabad, long live the revolution, they are being made, all kind of references they are to be in a way censored by the censor authorities. These kind of references were to be deleted by the censor authorities. Not only Indian films, but many of the American films which were dealing with the democratic ideas. There was a film called Captain of the Guard, which was made in 1936. There was another film called Night Without Armor, which was made in 1937, and there was another film called Kid Millions, made in 1935. So, they were making references to patriotism, independence, and all these kind of references to patriotism, independence and Gandhian philosophy, they were not being tolerated by censor authorities. So, what we see in this particular period is that not only Hindi films, not only Indian films, but foreign films like the European and American films, I have given the references as you can see on the screen as well. The 3 films I have mentioned. In all these films, a number of scenes and dialogues which were referring to all these kind of issues which were relating to the patriotism of the masses, the issues which were referring to independence of the country, and any of the ideals which were referring to the Gandhian philosophy, they were not being accepted by the censor authorities. So, censor authorities, they were quite vigilant in this context that any of the ideas which were there in terms of political portrayals, any of the ideas which were talking about democracy, any of the ideas which were talking about the revolutionary aspects, all this was deleted from the films, all this was deleted from the various portrayals which were there in the films. Apart from this, there were other themes which were also very, very important. For example, themes of workers' strikes. What we see in the national movement is that the themes of the peasants, the themes of the workers' strikes, they were also shown. So, British censor authorities, they were also quite concerned with all these kind of themes which were related to the peasants and the workers. And in many of the films, these kind of themes, the dialogues, etc., they were being removed by the censor authorities. During the national movement, what we see is that many of the Kisan Sabhas which were dealing with the peasant issues, many of the workers organizations, All India Trade Union Congress, etc., they were being established which were dealing with the issues of the workers. And when these kind of organizations, they were talking about all these kind of aspects which were dealing with these issues, and when they associated themselves with these kind of movements, as we see that in 1935 with the establishment of Progressive Writers Association and the establishment of IPTA, Indian People's Theatres Associations. So, many of the people, those who were associated with Progressive Writers Association and Indian People's Theatres Association, which were dealing with the progressive ideas, and IPTA was the cultural wing of the Communist Party of India. So, many people, those who had their sympathy with the cause of the peasants, many of them they had sympathy with the cause of the workers. When these people, those who were associated with these organizations, they were also working in the film departments, in the script departments, for example, of the films which were being produced. Bimal Roy was one, Salil Chaudhary was another, Pandit Ravindra Shankar or Ravi Shankar as we know him, then Shambhu Mitra. All these people, they were associated with IPTA. And these people, Balraj Sahni for example, and when these people they came to the various departments in terms of film production, their ideas and concerns, they were reflected in the films. Munshi Premchand was associated with the writing of a film called Mil or Mazdoor, which he wrote, though he was not happy with the situation in the film industry, and after that he did not write any story or any script for the film. This was the only film in which Munshi Premchand was associated. The other idea was the idea of communism or opposition to capitalism. This was also reflected in many of the films. The issue of class conflict, which the British or the colonial authorities they were not ready to accept. And in many of the films they deleted all the dialogues which were related to these kind of concerns, in which capitalism was supported and in which communism was supported, and in those references which were made to the films they were generally being censored by the authorities. I was talking about a film called The Mill or Mazdoor, which was directed by M. Bhavnani and which was based on the story of Munshi Premchand, and it was also talking about the labor and capital conflict. And when this film was made, it had a lot of problems with the censor authorities, and many of the dialogues, many of the scenes of this film they were being deleted, many of the dialogues they were excised, they were cut, and it was generally said that it was a travesty of mill life and management. And these kind of portrayals, they will be harmful to the relations between the employers and workers in India. So this film was banned by the censor authorities, and the censored version it was given a new title, the title of Seth Ki Ladki, or the merchant's daughter. So it was some sort of a truncated version of this film. And when this film was made with this title, it was again prohibited by the censor authorities. On the ground, I would like to quote, "There is running throughout the film the idea of the conflict of capital and labor, that much of the film depicts the squandering by members of the capitalist class of money earned by labor, in contrast with the squalid conditions under which labor lives, and that it is a direct incitement to discontent in labor circles." So what we see is that the references are generally made that the conflict of the capital and labor will be reflected, and these kind of portrayals which were talking about this kind of conflict, in which Britishers, those who were supporting the capitalist ideas and the government, they were also against all kind of movements which were associated with labor, be it the Kisan Sabha movements or the labor movements, and these kind of movements were also against the colonial rule. What we see is that Congress is also supported by the peasant movements and All India Kisan Sabha, and the other Kisan Sabha organizations, they were supporting Congress in some way, and at the same time many of the workers, they also joined their cause with the Congress leadership. So what we see is that in this film, Aruna Vasudev, she has worked a lot on the censorship policy, and she has also written a book on cinema and censorship. In this context, she has worked on censorship during the colonial period, and she says that Daya Ki Devi, or the goddess of mercy, this film was released, this was the third time this film was, Mill and Mazdoor, was released with this kind of title. And in this film all scenes of rowdyism, they were shown in the context of the mill hands. For example, the beating of the mill officers, they were generally entirely omitted. Then all scenes of mob incitement, they were also toned down. Then in many of the scenes in which mill hands and their leaders, they were shot by the mill owners, these kind of, and the kind of references which were made in terms of shooting in the later in the film, they were generally being toned down or they were being removed. And at the same time, scenes of seduction of women workers in the mill, they were also generally removed. Then in many of the scenes, the workers, they were going on their strikes, and the employment of the blacklegs to break the strikes that was being done, and the picketing by the strikers. So all these kind of film, all these kinds of scenes which were dealing with the kind of happenings which generally took place when a strike was launched by the workers, all these were generally removed by the censors. So the censors, they were quite sensitive to all these concerns with regard to the life which was concerning the workers, and they were being removed. British, they had all these kind of fears with regard to the question of the mainstream of the national movement, because national movement was an all-encompassing movement in which various strands they came together. Gandhi in a way wanted to take various factions together, be it the factions of the peasants, the factions of the workers, the upper classes or the middle classes, the capitalist class. So, Gandhi wanted some sort of an all-inclusive movement, and in that all-inclusive movement the various considerations of different classes they had to be kept in mind. And what we see is that there was a rising popularity of the communist movement as well. With the arrival of the Communist Party of India and the various bodies which were throwing their weight for the movement of the workers, we see some sort of a surge with regard to the peasant movements and the workers movements. And at the same time, the impact of the Marxist ideas on the revolutionary movements which were initiated by Bhagat Singh, Chandrasekhar Azad, etc. And we find that some kind of ideological shift of Bhagat Singh towards when he focuses on socialism and Marxism, and various bodies which emerged, even the arrival of the Congress Socialist Party. Within the Congress Party there was a wing which came in 1930s which was talking about the socialist aspects, and the various other organizations like All India Trade Union Congress, etc., which were being formed during this particular period. Apart from the British fears which were in domestic nature, they had fears internationally as well. What we see is that there is a development of the former Soviet Union during the Great Depression. What we see is that many of the countries across Europe, they got affected during the Great Depression in 1929-30, which emerged in America and with the Wall Street crash, and thereafter it spread to other parts of the world. But Soviet Union was one economy which was not influenced in negative way during the Great Depression, and this was talked about in various circles, that this was all because of the kind of ideals or ideas on which Soviet economy was based. At the same time, what we see is that there is a growth of communist ideas during this particular period in European intellectual community and in China. So, what was happening, that these kind of ideas they were not in any way favored by the colonial authorities, those who were in support of the capitalist governments worldwide, and they had this kind of fear that if all these kind of communist ideas they will be allowed to perpetuate, then there will be some sort of a threat to kind of the capitalist governments which were being followed or controlled by the colonial authorities. The continuous growth in the strength of the Communist Party of China in comparison to Kuomintang or KMT, this also alarmed the colonial government internationally, and in this way what we see is that they got concerned about all these issues. There was a film which I would like to talk about, which was known as Bala Joban or Youth on Fire, which was made in 1934, and a number of dialogues they were being omitted from this film. I would like to quote the dialogue. Is humanity in the grip of evil when man, children of the same maker, live on the blood of their fellow men? The rich feed themselves on the poor, while the poor eat dust and live at the expense of dogs. So, what we see is that they are making some kind of references in the question of class conflict which is there, and what we see is that how poor and the rich they are being portrayed in the films. And when we say poor eating dust and living at the expense of dogs, there is a striking resemblances where you will find in many places that dogs and the poor people, they are fighting for the leftovers in the dustbins we will find. And one of the I like to make a recent reference while I was driving down one of the streets in Delhi itself, where the kind of grains which were thrown for pigeons, etc., they were being collected by some of the people, those who were very poor. So, even in a place like Delhi where per capita consumption, per capita income is much more, you will find so much poverty. So, this kind of poverty in terms of class conflict, this kind of poverty in the context of inequality, the people those who are rich are very rich, the people those who are poor, those who are living in slums are comparatively very, very poor. So, these kind of concerns they were quite resented by the colonial authorities, because they had this kind of fear that all these kind of communist and Marxist ideas, they will incite the Indian masses, and they may not revolt against the colonial authorities in some way. And many of the Indian producers, when they tried to portray all these kind of films, they tried to relocate this kind of portrayals to an earlier period. There was a film called Banarsi Thug which was made, in which setting was to be the 15th and 16th century. So, the kind of reflections which were comparatively newer or recent in 19th and 20th century, but they were portrayed in a different era or age, so that they are able to hoodwink the censor authorities. That was one of the aspects which was being done during this particular period as well. There was an American film called The Affairs of Voltaire, which was made in 1934. In this film, you will find that many of the dialogues, they were being deleted. One dialogue which I would like to quote is, "Why should the poor die like rats in their holes? Why should nobles eat of the fat of the land? Why should we endure this injustice? Food for the poor, food for the poor." So, what we see is that all these kind of dialogues which are coming from America, they are also advocating all these kind of aspects which were relating to the question of equality. That why this kind of the kind of resources which are available, they should only be given to the upper class or the people those who are affluent. Why should not those kind of resources which are available, they should be equitably distributed among the masses. So, all these kind of references which were made in these kind of films was not liked by the censor authorities, and they rejected such kind of portrayals. I would like to point out certain examples. There was a film called Sant Tulsidas which was made in 1934, and in this film producers, they were asked to omit all kind of references in which lower caste Hindus, they were admitted to Hindu temples. So, because this kind of untouchability practice which was there in India at that time. So, when these kind of portrayals, they might offend some of the people, those who were supporters of these kind of earlier practices. So, censor authorities, they were quite concerned with the sensitivities of the people with which they were dealing. There was a film called Mahatma, as I have talked about earlier, which was based on the life of Saint Eknath. It was a Marathi film made in 1935, and it was also talking about untouchability, and it was later released as Dharmatma. So, what we see is that the government is censoring scenes of socio-religious reforms which were there in many of the films. During the Bhakti movement, during the medieval period which we see, and the Bhakti movement was talking about the question of equality. It was also talking about the removal of untouchability. So, these kind of ideas, they were also there in the most potent phase of the national movement, that is the Gandhian phase. So, that Gandhian phase from 1915 onwards, or to be specific, when Gandhi initiated his 3 movements in 1917 till 1947, you have all these kind of ideas. So, these Gandhian ideas, Gandhian philosophy, Gandhian ideology, when it was reflected on in many of these films, they were not being liked by the censor authorities, and they wanted that all these films, they were to be censored, their dialogues, they were to be in any way omitted. So, these kind of measures were taken by the colonial government. In 1930s, what we see is the stringent British censorship. Many of the objectives and the ideals of the national and the communist, nationalist and the communist movements, they were being deleted, and many of the films which were showing the obscene scenes, they were being allowed to be given to, or in any way exhibited to the masses, because the colonial authorities, they were not in any way concerned with the sex and violence which was being shown in the when many European films, they were more concerned with the political ideas, so that people may not get acquainted with those kind of political ideas. So many of the scenes which were cheap and obscene, they were being allowed by the censorship authorities. Then they also felt that Indian intellectual community felt that if these kind of films they will be allowed to be exhibited, then they might damage the morals of the younger generation. So they clamored against them. They wanted the censorship authorities to become more and more sensitive towards these kind of aspects, and they wanted them that these kind of scenes and dialogues and portrayals, they should be deleted. And many of the magazines like Abhyuday and Film India, they carried a number of articles over such kind of portrayals, and they asked the censor authorities that these kind of portrayals, they should not be allowed in India. And they also felt that British, they had some kind of sinister designs in this context, that they wanted to devalue the Indian morals in that context, and they wanted the younger generation to go astray, so that if they had some kind of alignment, if they had some kind of interest in the ideals of the national movement, they might go astray. So all these kind of concerns, they were being raised by a number of magazines in the press, and they also asked the colonial authorities to do away with such kind of portrayals. Another important aspect which I would like to talk about is the question of Muslim sentiments. What happened during the 1857 revolt, that both Hindus and Muslims, they participated in the revolt wholeheartedly, and this kind of united strength of the Hindus and Muslims was not liked by the colonial authorities. And after that, they followed a policy of divide and rule, so that the bonds of friendship between both the communities, Hindus and Muslims, they could be weakened. So from 1970s onwards, what we see is that they tried to weaken the national movement, especially the one which was initiated in 1885 with the emergence of the Congress. And British, they had this kind of sinister or evil design to follow this kind of policy of divide and rule, so that they do not find Hindus and Muslims on the same boat. On the one hand, at some times they were appeasing the Hindu community, and on the other they were trying to appease the Muslim community. In 1920, what we see, there was a golden opportunity which was seen by Mahatma Gandhi when Khilafat movement was launched with the help of Ali brothers. So Ali brothers, Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali and Mahatma Gandhi, they started this Khilafat movement when the British government their policies led to the dismemberment of the Turkish Empire. So this movement, which later merged into the non-cooperation movement, was started by Gandhi and Ali brothers, and in which you will see that Hindus and Muslims, they came wholeheartedly together. But the British, they had all these kind of concerns in which they wanted that Muslim sentiments, they may not get affected. In many of the censor boards, you will find one or two Muslim members as well, and they were ready to omit all such kind of references in which if they were in any way inimical to the interests of the Muslims. So in order to wean Muslims away from the national mainstream, British, they tried to in a way satisfy them, and they made them members of certain boards in which their concerns and ideas they were being listened to, and the scenes and dialogues in which they had any kind of problems, they were being rejected by the censorship authorities. So what we see is that the fear of hurting the Muslim sentiments, not only in the films which were made in India, but the films which came from abroad also, they were being rejected by the censorship authorities. There was a film called The Virgin of Istanbul, which was made in 1920, and it was passed by the censor board of Burma, but it was banned by the Bombay board. As I told you earlier, that we had 4 censor boards initially, because these were basically seaports, and Burma was part of the Indian Empire at that time, so there was a censor board in Burma as well. This film was rejected by the Bombay board which felt that it will offend the Muslim community. The S.T. Bhaskaran, who has worked on censorship policy in India, the colonial censorship policy in India, he says that there was a film called 40th Door, which was made in 1925, and in this film there was some kind of conflict which was shown between the Christians and Muslims in the Middle East. This film was proscribed in Bombay and then in other provinces because it was trying to depict Egyptian officials in an unsavory light. So the colonial censorship was in a way was very sensitive to such kind of portrayals, and they rejected all these kind of portrayals which in any way were not acceptable to the people in India, those who were in the censor boards. And as I already told you that they were trying to placate or appease the Muslim sentiments, and one or two Muslim members, they were being incorporated into the various boards, and their ideas and their concerns they were listened to by the colonial authorities, and then they made their own decisions in this regard. Another film I would like to talk about was called Shiraz, which was made in 1928, and it was dealing with the story of a potter who designed the Taj Mahal and for expression of his love for Mumtaz, and this design got approved by Shah Jahan. So the concern was raised with regard to this film as well. A Muslim member of the legislature argued that Empress was seen as an ideal of perfection by many Muslims, and they would be displeased if these kind of portrayals they were being shown, and they asked the film to be banned. There was a film called Anarkali, which was banned in 1929 in Mangalore for the similar reasons, and this film was also proscribed throughout the country. So what we see is that a number of films, be it Shiraz, be it Anarkali, they were being banned, or dialogues got deleted or censored for some reason or the other, and they were generally with regard to the Muslim sentiments. So British, the kind of policies which they were following after 1857, they had this kind of concerns that Indians, especially the various factions like Muslims or Zamindars or other factions, they might not get displeased with the colonial authorities, and if they will be displeased with the colonial authorities, then they will create some kind of problems for them. So that is why in any way they did not want to displease these factions, and they kept their concerns in mind when they were censoring such kind of portrayals. What we see is that there was concern in Legislative Assembly as well, that Muslim concerns about films hurting their sentiments, they were felt in 1930 in the Legislative Assembly. There was a member Sheikh Sadiq Hassan. I would like to quote him: "There is a great resentment among the Muslim public when scenes of haram life are depicted in films, and especially when historic Muslim queens and princesses are shown making love." So these kind of concerns in which various queens which were Muslims, when they were being shown in unsavory light, that was not liked by the people, those who were Muslims. So when these kind of concerns were raised, then they were also discussed in the Legislative Assembly as well. I would like to quote Times of India dated 29th November 1935, which says that there was a scene of 250 feet which is showing that several Muslims are sitting around a table in a cosmopolitan club and they are drinking liquor, and it was removed from a film which was produced in Bombay. So they did not want to show Muslims in a club in which they are having liquor, because that will not be liked by the Muslims. So that is why these kind of scenes, they were also deleted, and censor authorities, they deemed it fit that no Muslim should be shown drinking liquor, and because that would offend the Islamic sentiments. So apart from that, another important concern was with regard to the relations with the princely states. British, they had learnt their lessons well during the revolt of 1857 as well, and they realized that princely states, they should be kept in good humor. And after the revolt of 1857, they tried to cultivate the friendship of the Zamindars and the princely states, and they catered to their demands as well. Lord Canning, who was the Governor General of India in 1857, he realized and acknowledged that the zamindars and the princes, they had acted breakwaters in the storm during the revolt of 1857, because many of the princes and zamindars, they supported the colonial rule, they supported the colonial masters, and many of them, if they did not support the people, those who were rebelling, the people, those who were in the favor of revolt, in indirect way supported the British as well, because the people, those who were associated with the revolt, did not get the active support of these princes and zamindars. So they wanted to reward them, and any of the films which were showing them in a negative manner, these films were also they were also censored by the colonial authorities. British wanted to in any way wanted to seek their support, and when they wanted to seek their support or the loyalty, then they wanted to save them from any kind of attack, any kind of cinematic attack which was launched by the people, those who were associated with the issue of filmmaking. So that was another important concern, apart from the concern which was shown by the British with regard to the issue of Muslims. So what we see is that, continuing from this, that in the cinematic attack over the princely states, there was another film called Terror or Chalta Purza, which was made in 1929, and this was the first film which was dealing with this issue. This film was made by the Sharda Film Company, and it was a story of an imaginary Maharaja of Kantipur and the resident. Resident was the British resident. So Bombay Board, which censored the film, made the remark that the film was a parody on mannerisms of native rulers, and they will have some kind of negative impact between the Britishers and the native rulers. So that was one idea, that the relations between the colonial rulers and the relations between the native princes, they will be affected because of such kind of portrayals, and that is why this film was not acceptable to the colonial authorities. Another film called Searchlight, it was also proscribed or in a way censored, that it will bring disrepute to the rulers of the Indian princely states. So what we see is that Britishers, they were quite concerned about the princely states. As we have seen, they had their own reasons as well, because they wanted to secure the support of the princely states or the colonial ruler or the native states for continuance of their rule. And when they wanted to continue in the rule, continue to rule India, then they wanted to secure the support of such powerful faction. And the princely states, they were one of the important factions, those who were quite important in terms of continuance of the colonial rule. So to secure their support, the Britishers, they wanted that in any film which are showing them in any negative way, they should not be allowed to be exhibited in India. In South India, what we see is that many of the zamindars and the big landlords, those who have supported the British during the civil disobedience movement, they were also given some kind of protection by the colonial authorities. There was a film called Raitu Bidda, Telugu film, which was made in 1940, which was dealing with the zamindari system and rural indebtedness, and it was proscribed by the censorship authorities. The magistrate of Nellore and the government of Madras also supported this kind of ban, because British, they wanted to shield all those who were from this zamindari class, and British, they did not want that their portrayals should be there in any negative way. Now I would like to talk about certain American films. American films, many of the American films which were shown in India, exhibited in India, which were imported from America or Hollywood as it is popularly known, they championed the cause of freedom and liberty. And many of the films which were talking about these ideas of freedom and liberty or the democratic ideas, they faced some kind of negative reaction of the censorship authorities. Censorship authorities, those who wanted to, censorship authorities which were in a way controlled by the colonial government, wanted the continuance of the colonial rule in India. And these kind of issues which were dealing with the democratic aspirations were not in any way liked by the colonial authorities. There was a film called Patriot which was made in 1928, and it was a different film. In an Indian film was also there with the title, same title, and this American film was dealing with some kind of popular uprising and some overthrow of authority. So this film was also not liked by the censorship authority, and it was banned and excised. There was another film called Hutch of the USA which was made in 1926, and as you can see on the screen as well, there was a subtitle in the film which says that we are fighting for freedom from tyranny as your country once did. So there is a direct reflection of the national movement of India, that they are also fighting to acquire freedom as America once fought their war of independence against the British as well. And the censor board, it asked for a subtitle to be changed which says that dreamed of a day when the government would be government of the people for the people, should be substituted, dreamed of a day when peace and contentment would prevail in the land. So when a film called Hutch of the USA is talking about that they are dreaming of a day when the government would be of the people and for the people, so it is directly talking about democracy. So these kind of dialogues, they were to be substituted with that there would be peace and contentment. So peace and contentment could be there when, even if there is no democratic government, when there is no self-government. So the British authorities, they felt this way, that how these kind of democratic aspirations which were reflected in many of the dialogues, they were to be substituted with those words which could not in any way incite the Indians to achieve independence. Another film called Howards of Virginia which was made in 1942, it also dealing with the family in breaking away of colony of Virginia from British, and it was also talking about the revolutionary ideas and expressions of freedom and liberty, and it was suggested that they will be harmful, and this film was also proscribed by the provincial government and without any reference to the censor boards. So what we see is that not only Indian films but a number of American films, they were being proscribed or censored. Many of the dialogues, they were being deleted, many of the scenes they were being omitted from these films as well. So British, they had all these kind of fears in their minds, not only nationally, not only from the Hindi films or the indigenous films or the Indian films which were made in India, but at the same time from the other films as well which were being imported from America as well. So British, they wanted to delete and remove all these kind of dialogues. In the next discussion, we will talk about the changes which came with the Government of India Act which came in 1935. We have already discussed some of the aspects which were there earlier in the cinema of 1920s and earlier 30s, and from 1935 onwards, with the coming of the Government of India Act, we will continue our discussion in the next session on Monday. Till then, have a very good day. Thank you.
With this note, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us such a productive session. As Dr. Manoj himself said, that we would be discussing more on cinema and censorship on Monday. That is, we would be conducting another productive session for you, and I hope that this session would be productive for you. That is the another one which is all lined up for you. Dear friends, for your knowledge, I would like to tell you all, because theatre and cinema has a deep connection. Today is World Theatre Day. 27th March is celebrated as World Theatre Day, and in 1961 the theatre was that is the World Theatre Day. The day of this this day was initiated for celebration by the International Theatre Institute. So on this day, very congratulations to you all, and thank you, sir. Thank you so very much.